History of Weapons, we're going to take a look at the Glock 17. The Glock 17 is one of the most used sidearms for military and police throughout the entire planet. But it all began with Gaston Glock, born in Vienna, Austria in 1929. Early on, Gaston Glock began his life as a chemist and engineer, focused most of his efforts in ferric nitrocarbonizing, which is a process invented in England designed to harden steel, primarily for use of pistons and engine blocks. Gaston Glock used this process to be an inventor and created a company along with his wife. Primarily what they were making is rods and knives for the Austrian military out of their garage. In 1980, they purchased an injection molding machine, put together a group of chemical engineers to focus on hardening plastics primarily for handles on his knives. This group of chemical engineers produced some of the toughest plastics and polymers we've ever seen on the planet up until that time. Other products Gaston Glock would make was camera parts as well as entrenching tools. In 1980, Austria announced it would be seeking tenders for a new sidearm replacing the Walther P38. Also announced by the Austrian military was they'd be using an extreme testing process that would challenge the major gun manufacturers of that time. Gaston Glock, having ties and experience receiving military contracts, believed he could use his skills in hardening polymers to produce a gun that can compete in these trials. What this gun had to achieve was it had to be a 9mm with a 9+1 capacity, no more than 58 parts, no more than 20 malfunctions and 10,000 rounds. And after 15,000 rounds, they would inject a highly pressurized 9mm parabellum with a 73,000 psi, double the maximum pressure for a 9mm. And then after that, it still had to be a usable pistol. So Glock put his team of chemical engineers, knife and camera makers, and they created the Glock 17. During production, these engineers essentially used a modified Browning cam-lock system for charging and recharging the semi-automatic system, as well as a striker-fired mechanism originally introduced in 1907 by Ross Dyer with the 7.65mm Ross Dyer 1907. Production took between 1979 and 1982. The Glock 17 was named the 17 because it was the 17th patent owned by Gaston Glock. And in the end, the Glock came out on top, beating major guns like the H&K P7M8, the P7M13, and the P9S. Sig Sauer introduced the P220 and the P226. Beretta introduced the 92 SBF, FN Herstal, the Browning High Power, and Steyr-Mannlicher, the GB. In these Austrian trials, Glock 17 outperformed all of them. In 1985, the U.S. Department of Defense was seeking a new sidearm to replace the 1911. Glock declined this introduction because they were asking Glock to retool the Glock 17 as well as give them 35 samples in a very short time, and Glock politely turned them down. Also that same year, Sweden and Norway were looking for new sidearms. The test both those countries used was the NATO standards for testing. So the Glock 17 was adopted by both those countries, and at that time, Glock received the NATO classified sidearm, so any country can adopt the Glock 17. And military and police all over the world did, with 65% of military and police today using some sort of Glock pistol, and 60 countries using the Glock 17 as their sidearm. Results in the Austrian trial sparked a wave of interest in Western Europe, making its way all the way to the US. Today there's 5 generations of the Glock 17, with dozens of models, all resembling the fit and function of the Glock 17. Now the corporation's called Glock GmbH. This major corporation has been a target of multiple embezzlement attempts, including the 2012 CEO, who was convicted of racketeering. Subsidiaries of Glock GmbH include Glock USA, Glock Hong Kong, Glock Middle East, as well as Glock Brazil. Today, Glock firearms are most famous for being extremely accurate and extremely reliable. And there's no doubt in my mind why it is the military and police as well as civilians use the Glock pistol. So there you go. There's the history of the Glock 17. And as evil always shows its ugly head, good must always rise against it. And it's firearms like the Glock 17 that allow us to do that. Thank you for watching this episode of the History of Weapons.